Thank you, Joe. It's working? Yep. So good afternoon. My name is Ben Pintos Oliver. I'm here today to talk to you about the brand gap. So I guess the reason why I'm standing here talking to you today is, as Joe mentioned, I've had quite a bit of experience working in agencies, working with publishers, working in-house with different types of clients. And for some reason, I've started to move more recently into the world of brand. Unfortunately, what I've been seeing is a very slow part of the industry trying to play catch up with a lot of product businesses and teams. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of really great people and individuals that are out there. And what I've been doing over the past few years is getting to know these people and finding out what's actually holding them back, what are they wanting to do more of. And more recently at the Boston Consulting Group with the digital ventures arm of the business, I was exposed to some really interesting, I guess, pace when it comes to coming up with ideas for these businesses and trying to understand what should be their next step. Should it be a new product? Should it be evolving something that they already have in their portfolio? And how quickly can they get that out into market? And after working there for a few years, I found that as we started to come up with these ideas, build it and push it out into market, some of the problems was that these third-party companies, like branding, like marketing, like advertising, were being brought in, yet their models of taking 3, 6, 9 months to do what they normally do wasn't cutting it when it came to getting this stuff out into market. And it was causing a lot of pain for the product team. The product teams that I was running, and I wanted to do something about that. So this really talks to, I guess, my journey throughout this. And after this presentation, I'm very interested to hear from all of you as well about your perspectives on this. So, I am talking about brand, but I know a lot of you are product people. So the first question is, how many of you are designers? Can I see a quick hands? Okay. Out of you, who's service or strategic design? Okay, good. UX? Majority, good. A lot of you putting your hands up multiple times, that's even better. Visual design, user interface design? Good portion there. Branding? Yeah, okay. 6, maybe. Other?
Content strategy.
Great. Excellent. That's very interesting. Okay, great. CX strategy. Excellent. So how many of you would have worked for a good brand? Do you think that you've worked for a good brand in the past? Okay. You're not getting recorded, so no one's watching you. How many of you could stand up here and confidently explain to everybody or define what is a good brand? Half, one, half, 1, 2. Okay, it's about 3 people there. So it's quite interesting, right? And we talk about, what does a good brand look like? A lot of brand presentations talk a significant amount about this. I'm not going to do that. I just think a really great brand is something that is memorable, and that memorable doesn't come through its marketing or advertising or its logo or just its product or service. It's actually the combination of all of those things. I was getting ready for coming into work, and I was humming. My daughter had slipped into the bathroom, and she had said, "What's that song you're Daddy?" She's starting. I hadn't realised I was doing it, but I was pretty much humming the Aeroplane Jelly song. Okay. And I've sort of finished with that, "Aeroplane jelly for me." She just looked at me weird. So look, that was created in 1937. I read the whole backstory behind that, thought it would be a nice little anecdote for this presentation. But it's a memorable brand, whether it is through advertising or it's just through a great product experience. And I think we need to understand that moving forward and thinking about how these teams are going to work with each other in the future. So the brand, it comes from the people that create it, the people that market it. But unfortunately, a lot of people have sat there, and the only way that it's actually moved forward is through hope. Very little validation has been done in the past to try and understand whether or not brands are going to make it out there. Product design, we're starting to see a lot more people be a lot more agile, lean, applying lean canvas models to try and understand, are we looking at the right problem first before we even go into solution mode? And I think there's something to take away from that and to think about that from a brand perspective. Now, a lot of you might say, but what happens if you're a fashion brand? If you were a fashion brand and you were trying to pave the way for people, a lot of them say, well, why would you do user testing to say, do you like this brand? Do you like this approach? Because I think the majority of people would turn around and they would say, oh, look, I think that's weird. I think that's really strange. Why would you apply a meat dress onto someone and wear fluoro glasses with peacock feathers? It just doesn't make sense. And so, fashion and a few other industries like that, I don't think this really applies as much. But for everyone else, I think there's a lot of consideration there, and we need to think about it from a customer perspective just as much. So the idea is, let's get rid of this concept of hope, and let's start applying some science to it. We start here with the needs pyramid. How many of you have seen this before?
Just this week as well.
Just this week. Okay, excellent. This needs pyramid is broken up into a number of different elements. So it's broken up into the 4 segments: functional, emotional, life-changing, and social impact. The more a brand or a product or service can meet these and tick it off, the more affinity or advocacy a customer will have for it. On top of that, it actually has a correlation to the amount of revenue that business will make as well, which is quite interesting. So if we take an example of that, so say Facebook, a social utility that connects you with the people around you. Now this is debatable. I kind of did this at about 11 p.m. I showed my wife, and she kind of glazed over a little bit and just rolled over to sleep. But look, if you look at Facebook, and so we start with functional, there's a lot of variety in terms of the features that are available to you as a user. There's a hell of a lot of quality in there in terms of the thinking, either through UX, information architecture. Interface is, it's pretty clean cut, but there's a lot of information there, and it's, for some people you might say it saves you time. For others, say it sucks your time away from you. The emotional state, there's a lot of nostalgia in Facebook because you have your photo libraries. I don't know if anyone's. I find it hard to talk about this because I haven't used it in about 6 to 9 months, but I do remember it had a feature that shows you what you were doing a year ago, and you sort of look at a photo of yourself and you're like, oh God, is that what I was doing? And there's always these sort of memories and connections that they try to bring up from the past, so it's quite strong. And then as you start moving up into life-changing, the sort of heirloom moments of being able to look at different categories of photo albums as well, and just be taken back into that emotional stage is a really interesting and powerful piece. So this is really interesting, and any of the products that you're working on, if you're trying to create something, try to sort of step away from, at times, the the work that you're doing in the grass, and try and shift back and start looking at these things and saying, how many of these can I actually tick off? So why focus on the brand? I think it has a significant role to play in an Omni experience. These days, for a lot of our customers, they don't only just sit in print, they don't only sit in digital, they sit across many different types of channels, and there's an expectation for these to have a seamless experience. Yet there are a lot of businesses and products out there that don't do this. And one of the things that we do as humans is we love to identify patterns. This happens on a subconscious level as well as a conscious level. In the subconscious, if we were to take in every single piece of data that's in and around us, whether that's sense, smell, touch, feel, we would actually explode. We wouldn't be able to consume that much information. So the brain tries to find out ways to kind of push things away, haze it out, and just concentrate on what's important to you. And that's really quite interesting, right? Because as you start thinking about maybe something like advertising or marketing, trying to push people or hook people into a product or a service, you've got to think about what are those common patterns that we're seeing throughout that path. It might be something as simple as a heading, a H1, or a button, or an image. Very simply put, if you click on an EDM and you see a particular hero image and a particular title, and you click on to a website and it's different, you think for a second there, am I in the right place? Have I actually gone to the wrong section? Did they not link it properly? So these are just some quick examples of that. And so my background sort of looks at a range of different types of sets, both hard and soft skills, and what you could typically call a jack of all trades. And I think luckily these days jacks are starting to come back into the industry as a well-needed person because of these Omni experiences. So I'm lucky in that sense. But I spent quite a bit of time over in the UK, and I came back after being in a lot of moving more into the product space, because I just enjoyed looking down into the depth of the needs of people and whether or not we were actually validating some of the crazy ideas that we were coming up with. And although that is lots of fun, I started to realize it was more fun to when they were true as well. So there's four things that I've started looking at as I started transferring into that space and to this day here. And those four things sort of come down to how do you get your product market ready? I think this is a really important thing. It doesn't matter if you're just a designer, you could be a developer, product owner, the owner of the business. It doesn't matter what role you are, that's really important. How do you reduce your debt? So whether that's design or tech debt, it's great to go a million miles, but if you've forgotten to do a few things, you're going to have to go back and do those. And that's going to stop your velocity. And so we've got to think about how can we reduce that debt. The third is around, can brand and product coexist with each other? Because at the moment I haven't seen some great experiences of that. There's a few small great moments that I've seen. So how do we expose that a little bit more? And the fourth is around, does branding need to change its approach, or does product as well? So current landscape, it's kind of like playing a song in the wrong key. What we have is we have brand 2 octaves down here playing a C chord, and we have product up here. And the sort of end result of that is you can understand the song, like you recognize it, but there's something weird, something going on that's not quite right. And so, as you all know, from a brand perspective, they're very traditional in their approach. It's about completing the design up front, high fidelity straight away. It's very approval driven, so you've got to go through all your steps and make sure you get sign off from all the stakeholders and everyone before you can transfer into design and into production. And it's very risky because of the lack of validation. Product is quite the opposite. So it's very agile, it's fast-paced, it's experimental, and the reason for doing all of that is to try and rinse out as much risk as possible, to try and understand, are you actually going in the right direction? And will your customers actually like what you're doing? So I'm going to try and skip through this quite quickly. This is, I guess, the old road, and I guess the main point here is the build happened over a long period of time, 1 to 2 years, heavy investment, big teams working for long periods of time, and they were only able to validate what it is that they were doing with real customers at launch. And you would see big companies never would actually turn around and say that was a failure. They couldn't say that, because if they said it was a failure, they'd get fired. So they said, that's interesting. Why don't we pivot and we'll decide, okay, we'll add some features to it. So suddenly you had all these products out there that do absolutely everything but nothing very well. In this new world, and then branding would have a good chunk of time to be able to do what they do, as would advertising and marketing as well. So they had plenty of time before the launch to get everything in line so that they were ready to go to market. The new road is different. So we have here very quick business development, a quick bit of research to understand, do you have the right problem space? Discovery kicks in quite quickly to try and, I guess, understand which of those approaches do you want to take up. And you start moving forward with the most desirable, viable, or feasible solution. As you quickly move into a build phase, we look to commercialize straight away. So as we're building this, what is it that we're building? What are we trying to drive for? What's our North Star? And you try and aim for shorter segments, so MVP, minimal viable product, shifting to a minimal marketable. We're quite confident now, let's put some advertising dollars behind that, or start looking at some growth hacking opportunities. And then if you work for a consultancy, it's all about the business, so a minimal viable business. How can we sell off this business if necessary, so we can at least get some value for that? And so if you looked at the same time frames there, you start putting in branding at this point here, all of a sudden you're already out in market by the time they would finish. And then you start layering over advertising, well, you're already out in market for quite a considerable amount of time. What are we going to do? What are we going to do in this space? And the reason you can only start there is at the end of discovery, you've said, hey, this is a really good idea. We should go out and build this. But if you've done your work in a certain way, you don't really know what the end solution is going to be. It drives the client nuts. But you say, look, I think it's going to be something in this direction, but we don't know what the end outcome is. And so a lot of people turn around then and say, the question of, does brand come first? Does product come first? Which one needs to take lead? And it's a really interesting question and a big debate that goes on. So quickly, what is the difference between, what are the different stages of the branding approach? The 4 Ds are kind of 30, 40 different businesses, and this is kind of what it generally looks like. Discovery, which is research. Define, which is their strategy and positioning. Develop in terms of, let's create a visual identity, and then deliver in terms of production. And that can take sort of, appropriately, 6 months, give or take. So dive into branding. I'm going to go through this quickly. In terms of processes, there's a lot of pain here, mostly around collaboration. Strategic and design is usually quite disconnected, but from an output perspective, there are some beautiful things that are being done, but it's about trying to find out how can we connect them better with the actual products so they don't seem like two very different things. So what does it mean for the product teams? I'm just going to run through these quickly. I think there's one. There we go. So if you're a small business, like a startup, you can actually, the risk there is a little bit lower. But if you're a business, the size really does matter because it's a multiplier and it compounds. So for example, if you're taking a brand and then trying to interpret that into your products, you might have multiple teams all trying different subjective ways of interpreting that brand, because your brand guidelines never have the level of detail or the context of what you're designing, whether that's in a mobile, on a billboard, or in a social banner. So it's really important to get into that and try and find out how can you minimize that gap. So there's kind of two solutions that you could possibly look at here. Do I postpone my launch, or do I go with the same launch and just do some redesign later? The problem with postponing your launch is that you're going back into the old model. You stop, you delay that feedback response from your customers. And if you just go a million miles ahead, you're going to have a lot of design tech debt and the potential of an agency coming up with a completely new brand, which might actually impact your product as well. So you have to go back and redesign it. So it looks pretty dire, and a lot of people go, well, should we pack up shop or pretend it's not happening? And it's usually the latter. So going back to the questions, with great hardship, we get this thing out into market. We've got two options here that don't seem very, very good. Brand and product can coexist, but there seems to be a lot of friction there. And yes, of course, branding has to change their approach, but maybe product needs to do something as well. So let's think about how can we look at this gap. So there's a whole bunch of themes here. There's too many to discuss, but dealing with things like digital first seems to be a lot of a great word that's thrown around these days within agencies. And so I've sort of labeled that hex first. The idea of color palettes and the amount of agencies that sit there and say, oh, I think this beautiful crimson blue or midnight blue is going to work really well. And we say, okay, well, what's the text font going to be on top of that? And they said, oh, white, okay. But most of our text is usually black, and we don't have white backgrounds. And you just sort of see this pause, and both groups are so frustrated at each other, even at that very basic point when color is one of the first things in the style guide. And you think, oh God, we're going to have a long meeting here. So the interesting thing here is that the research that is conducted at the very start is about, it comes from the same place. So the research that you do with your customers helps define what your product is, it helps define what your business needs to be considering, and it also helps, did I say product? I said business, helps your brand as well. So a lot of you might have seen this little piece here. Very common within research to do the say, do, think, feel. The conscious mind as well, or the human mind is broken up into two sides, conscious and unconscious. And these feed into different layers here as well. And the idea is through research, you don't want to just stick with the say and do, you want to get into the think and feel. That's where the really interesting stuff is. And attitude is what happens over a longer period of time. And that's what you really want to see, because that's what's actually, you need to change people's attitudes most of the time, or actually play to it. Understanding your influences is really important as well. Really think about your audience. They're the people that use it, but you've got competitors, experts, leaders, staff, product teams. All of these people want their idea, their solution in there. How do you balance that? And you just need to remind these people as well that there are all of these influences in there. Audit principles. We recently did a little piece of work around principles, and it was scary to understand that most people don't know how to use principles. So I very much recommend go back to ground zero with these and think about, or ask your teams, how do we use principles? What's their role? How do I use it through my, how do I use it to rationalize my work? These things should be there to help you make design decisions that aren't so binary. and they very much help from a tonal aspect as well. Find your white space. So do your research, look at those principles that you have, and find out who's doing what in these areas, and where are the gaps in the market. Is there a particular reason for that gap? And then try and find out what your blue space is. So has anyone heard of blue ocean strategy before? Yeah, a couple of people. So it's quite famous with Cirque du Soleil, about looking at a whole bunch of attributes here and looking at how your competitors position themselves on that, and not necessarily doing the complete opposite of that, but thinking about what do you want to compete on in the red bloody sea where there is no real winner, and where's going to be your free ocean blue sailing where you don't need to compete. And this is really interesting, and I've started using this for design, where you can start changing those attributes, to visual and experience attributes, and start thinking, where do you think you should sit on here? And how do you compare to your competitors? And if you're an existing brand, where do you sit now, and where do you want to be in the future? And this really helps. Particularly when you can start taking that and, as a designer, empowering yourself to make good decisions on what you want to focus on. A lot of designers I've worked with in the past have had the pain of always being told, no, you can't actually go work on that, because a PO would be sitting there, a product owner, and saying, sorry, you've come to me 20 times today saying you want to work on interaction, you want to work on beautiful pictograms being animated, you want to work on transitions. Of course they're going to say no those 20 times because you haven't told them what you want to focus on. And what this does is it allows you as the designer to work out, do you know what, we're not going to worry too much about this red ocean stuff here, but what we're going to do is we're going to focus on these 4 things here. We think gesture, accessibility, tone of voice, and animation, meaningful transitions are going to be the 4 things we're going to concentrate on. And we've even gone through and understand how they relate back to our principles. We understand how competitor and analogous companies compare to us in this. We understand what impact this is going to have on the product, because we've spoken to some other people, developers, copywriters, and we know what the effort and costs are going to be as well. You've just done the majority of what the PO usually needs to do when they go to say yes. And so this is a really valuable tool for that. So going through some of these things, just be conscious of your color. Reduce your scope when you're working with the agencies. You don't need a full 130-page style guide designed for your product straight away. You probably need about 10. So think about what's mission critical for you and testing this with your users, and then build that out over time. Constantly talk about your principles. We used to print ours out really big up on the screens when I was doing a piece of work in Jakarta, Jakarta's first ever digital bank. We printed out our principles really nice and big, and whenever we did stand-ups, people would come with post-it notes and write up on there how they actually live the principles in their day-to-day. That's really great for starting culture, particularly if it was a Fortune 500 business pretending to be a startup. Constantly call out ambiguity. A lot of agencies go, you're going to get icons, illustration, photography, a whole bunch of things. But when they step away, what you actually get is a PDF with 5 icons on there. And it's just a conceptual look and feel. They haven't tested it at all the different sizes. They haven't looked at affordance. They haven't looked at a number of things. And that's not their fault. It's not because they don't know how to. It might be because of budget. It might be because of timing. It might be because they don't actually understand the context for you and what you're actually creating down here. So just be mindful of that, because the people that need to pick that up is the product people. I love this. I'm a primary color, and I'm also a primary color. Style guides these days get really flexible. Choose whatever color you want within these primary colors. Your developer turns around and says, well, what is it? what's the H1 color? I need to put a code in there. It's one or the other. So you've got to think about these things. It's fine to have flexibility, but you need to think about the context of that each time. Fidelity is really important. You don't have to go so high fidelity straight away. Experiment often. Measure the success of your design. This is probably one of the most important. So the Microsoft Desirability Toolkit, I think it has about 118 or so cards. So when you do your user flows with your users, customer journey, sorry, you run them through all of that, and then you say, what was your experience like? And you start with some really nice open-ended questions. So you might making sure that you don't create any biases. And then, if necessary, because people are not very good at articulating themselves, particularly feelings and things of that nature, these cards can help. And so they can do a little bit of card sorting, and it helps you understand, are the things that they're picking there, do they relate back to the principles that you had? Are you actually designing towards those? Is it helping? And this works really nicely alongside with comprehension tests and things of that nature. So defending your design, I love this space because a lot of people ask me about it, and they try to say, particularly designers that are just starting to kick off in their career, how do I make sure that I can convince somebody that this is the right design? And I said, you don't have to do it, your data should be able to do that for you. And a lot of times when people are disagreeing with you and you ask for their feedback, they love to give you solutions. They answer you in a solution. And rather than just taking that solution and going, okay, yes, I'll just design it exactly like that, go back and try and unpick what's the problem that they see within that. And you'll find out, actually, they just didn't want that drop shadow because it made it feel a little bit retro. You go, okay, well I can just remove that. I don't have to change the full color palette as well. So that's really interesting. There's a few other little points there. So just getting towards the end of this, people say, well, so who's leading who? And I don't think, a lot of people say I love to sit on the fence. It's not. It's that I just believe we should be doing it collectively. It shouldn't be one or the other. Sometimes it just happens that way. But even if somebody started before you, think about how can you leverage the research and the information that they've already got, and how can you work constantly in collaboration with them. Find common ground is the other piece. The thing that drives campaigns and marketing and all the sort of what you would call in the past above the line design. How does that relate to your digital design language or your lexicon, your sticker sheets? What is the relationship between that and its core design? That's influenced by three key things: brand positioning, your visual communication design fundamentals, shape, line, point, depth, the principles around balance, contrast. We all got taught that through our different sort of educations, yet we very easily forget that quickly after we leave. And we're going through a process at the moment of going back to that. How, as a brand, do we deal with shape? Do we deal with line? Do we deal with depth? And that's great fundamentals to apply back into your rationale. And my favorite at the moment is actual behavioral biases. So there's a whole bunch of these here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I very much encourage you as designers, either for branding or for product, to really get to know these. There are hundreds and hundreds of them out there, but these can be very, very powerful to understanding how it can influence your design. The baseline of your design, that's a given. You should always be doing good design, but it's about the experience as well. And I think from a brand's perspective, it's a really interesting place for them to start thinking more so in that space. Hick's law talks about the more options you give someone, the longer it takes for them to make a choice. So think about how can you break that down. Negative biases, there's a thing called the Gottman Ratio. It's 5 to 1. It's actually a really powerful thing. It helps with brand affinity. staff satisfaction at work, and even divorce. A lot of psychologists came together and realized that a couple would be sitting there having a verbal fight with each other. They'd be saying, one would say, I'm not happy. The other one says, well, we did beautiful things this week. We went out for dinner, I bought you flowers, and they'd sort of rattle off a bunch of things. And then the other person would sit there and say, but there was this one thing that happened. And they'd turn around and say, but that was one thing. We did 5 good things here. And the Gottman Ratio looks at that and says, for every one negative thing that you have, there are 5 positive things that has to make that neutral. Most of you are laughing, and I know why. That's very interesting when it comes to design. Think about your onboarding process when you bring in new people. If there's one bad experience that you have during your onboarding, you don't have many steps to convince them. And very quickly, people decide whether or not they're going to choose that product or not. So make sure it's always great. Goal gradient effect is a really good one as well. So if you want somebody to pick up your product and start using it, the more you use it, the better that product usually gives back features to you. So, but it takes time for them to actually get to that point. So how can you pick that up? In terms of visual design, you can give them small little incentives, which kind of goes to the point just above that. People love surprise and delight. So if you've got a goal, and it actually takes a while to get it, the closer that goal is, the quicker they are to actually engage in that and do something. So think about how do you break that up, and how do you take some surprise and delight. Might be a little pictogram, just animate it and it sort of pops. Small. Not every single thing that you do has to be monetary to your customers. It's not all silver and gold. And then a really funny one is loss aversion. Basically saying here that a loss makes people move quicker than a gain. So if I said to you tomorrow, I'll come and I'll work for your business, and I'm gonna usually be $100, but actually, if you book me right now, I'll be 50. So that's option 1. Option 2 is I say, I'm going to be $100. Sorry, I'm going to be $50, but if you book me, I'll give you a day and a half. I can guarantee you 1.5 to 2.5 times stronger is loss aversion. So when you're trying to incentivize someone, think about limited time only. That will make them actually take that quicker than the other one. So think less as individuals and more as a collective. I hope together we can mature the design practice together, not worrying about brand versus service design versus UX versus UI. Let's fill that gap together. Don't be afraid to experiment and try different methodologies. We all have very interesting backgrounds and crazy stories, and try to learn off each other and experiment with that often. Thank you.